Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CNN's Citizen by CNN. It's so great to have you here again. It's another Tuesday morning, and we have a great discussion planned. As you see on the screen, we are joined by David Chalian, John King, and, yep, you don't have to refresh your browser. It is right. We have the one, the only Christian Amanpour with us, and we are all so excited. Given Christian's presence, the focus of today's discussion is going to be on global affairs, and specifically on President Biden's global agenda, how it's going, how it's being perceived abroad. We have some great questions already submitted, and reminder that you can continue to submit your questions as we're having the discussion during our live discussion in the box on the right of your screen. Welcome, one and all. So, Christian, I want to start with this first broad question that we got from a viewer. What is the global view of our country, meaning America, and more importantly, American democracy right now?
Well, look, I can put it in terms of statistics. In the last several years, America has dropped from 22nd to 33rd in the global ratings on democracy. But more importantly, America has been through a really terrible assault on its own democracy from within, not to mention from outside by the Russians and the interference, but from within. And clearly people around the world are looking to see whether America still will fight for those values, hold those values up, and use them as what it always has done, which is the most important export that America has in the world. And we're watching at a time when a new administration, Biden came in promising, remember, a democracy summit. I'm not sure whether the date has been set for that, but people are really looking to see whether America will not necessarily dominate on the world stage, but lead. And leadership does matter, whether it's in convening a coalition that would have been indispensable during the COVID crisis in order to deal with it globally and in a coordinated way, or whether it is to keep security and also to promote the values of democracy and thus freedom. Right now, we're seeing democracy under assault, even in Asia, for instance, whether it's, the threat to Taiwan by China, the current assault on democracy in Hong Kong by China, the autocracy that's going on in Myanmar with the military junta wiping out the democracy there. And so, yes, people are concerned and want to see America come back to its traditional role. Because in the end, the health of the world depends on which system can best deliver freedom, human rights values, and social justice. That's where the competition is. And up until now, Western liberal values have won the day, but it's not so obvious anymore. And that's where the work needs to be done.
Yeah, you said it. And John, this is another viewer question. What is Biden's global agenda?
Well, in a word, it's partnership in the anti-Trump, if you will. Biden wants to present himself as the anti-Trump and to reinvigorate these alliances that Christian, implicit in her answer is that they are very frayed right now. So can you do it? He has John Kerry traveling the world, including to China, trying to put climate back on the agenda, trying to convince these countries that after 4 years of the United States not only pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, but pulling out of the conversation about climate change, that the United States is back. That climate's just one of the issues, but you will have the Leader Summit coming up very soon. And I think that shows one of the challenges of Biden. Biden is an old school in some ways. Climate is a newer issue for him, but he's old school. So Vladimir Putin is invited to speak at the Climate Leader Summit at a time when the administration is telling Vladimir Putin, you're a bad actor, we are going to sanction you. Are we going to sanction you for what you did in the election? We're going to sanction you for the big cyber hack. And we're watching you when it comes to Mr. Navalny in prison with more provocative actions around Ukraine. So can Joe Biden bring this realpolitik approach, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's challenges to come, that we're going to slap you and sanction you when we think you've been a bad actor? But if there are issues where we can have conversations and productive relationships, we're going to try that as well. That takes a lot of nuance and a lot of delicate balancing, especially when you have two powerful, stubborn players on the world stage like Russia and China. So I think the climate summit is the first public example of Biden trying to be that leader Christian talks about on the global stage. And it's a fascinating moment because these every day the list gets longer of the global challenges essentially knocking on the White House door at a time we all know the president would prefer to focus on the pandemic and the economy here at home.
Yeah, and there
Just,
is a lot of
just to
criticism
carry
here.
on, I don't know whether we're allowed to do this, but just to carry on
Yeah.
the Russia, we've just had the former head of the British Foreign Intelligence, so MI6, John Sawyer's, talking about what you just were talking about, Russia, what it does to Navalny, what it does in election interference, etc., Ukraine, etc. And he said the summit that Biden is calling, not just climate, but the summit he's proposed to Putin is massively important because the United States does need to, chew gum and walk at the same time. It needs to be able to silo off the things that it doesn't appreciate Russia doing, which are obvious, and contain Russia in the things that it does actually need to work with. The last thing the United States or the world needs is for Russia to implode, to collapse like the former Yugoslavia and all of that. So they don't want to see, they don't want to see a crumbling of the current Russia, but they do want to see it behaving many, many times better.
It's so important that you say that because the Biden administration is getting a lot of criticism here, Christian, for not being more aggressive in sanctions against Russia for all of the things, whether it's the election, SolarWinds, Navalny, the list goes on and on. David, I want to bring you in here. We were talking beforehand about all of the issues before the Biden administration and how it's perceived globally. But this is a viewer question asking, with all the issues this country faces, economic disparity, racial injustice, gun violence, health care deficiency, will the Biden administration focus on global issues, impact or deter them from resolving or at least make significant progress on our own country's issues that have lingered for generations?
Well, I mean, this is a requirement of the job. You have to be able to both govern domestically and maintain America's presence in the world. I do want to note, and I should also mention, it's part of the job. It's also in Joe Biden's DNA, right? I mean, this is somebody who served as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This is somebody that ended up in the Biden administration, as in the Obama administration, as vice president because of his heft in this arena. The Obama folks thought they needed a little bit of that with this young freshman senator, now president. And so Joe Biden, any of us have spent time with him. I mean, he fancies himself somebody sort of the world stage, has these relationships, has invested in them. And so the idea that this somehow would be ignored by this president solely to focus on domestic issues, I don't think the country would stand for it really if that were the case. And B, it's actually part of his, decades in Washington. A huge component of that has been in terms of foreign policy. I just want to note something that John said and tie it into what you're saying about the sanctions against Russia. John noted, rightfully so, of course, that Joe Biden campaigned on and is trying to govern in every way, especially in this realm of foreign policy, as the non-Trump, the anti-Trump. And yet, we've seen two big decisions so far that have been actually carrying forward on the Trump policy. One is the withdrawal from Afghanistan this year. I mean, that was Donald Trump set a May 1st deadline, and Joe Biden has now said by the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the full withdrawal will be complete of U.S. Troops in Afghanistan. But that's a continuation and a commitment to finishing out a Trump policy. That's one. And two, you listed all the things that the U.S. is sanctioning Russia for, but what it's not sanctioning Russia for yet is this notion that there are bounties on the heads of American service members in Afghanistan, paid for by the Russians. This was a story that came out last year that Joe Biden, as a candidate for the presidency, sort of slammed Donald Trump day in and day out for not taking action and not holding Russia accountable for that and not putting sanctions on Russia. And yet it's not one of the things that the Biden team is sanctioning Russia for right now. And in fact, they're questioning the legitimacy and the weight of the intelligence around that initial report. So as much as he can try to be the anti-Trump, and he is, I'm not suggesting they have the same worldview at all. I just think the reality of the job also shows at times that there are these odd moments of continuation of where Trump was on something, even if his position is to portray himself as the anti-Trump.
Christian, this is something that came up with a new question that just came in from a viewer, and I'm really interested to get your take. And it's about gun violence in America. And the question is, even with President Biden's global agenda, the biggest issue, like millions of others here, is the reporting of mass shootings within the country happening almost daily. Do you think President Biden should put this as his top priority along with COVID and pass additional executive orders? And then goes on to say there's no need for assault weapons of any kind to be in the hands of Americans. I'm just going to add to that great question by asking, since you are abroad and you understand how America is perceived abroad, what is the perception of America as now? I mean, as of Sunday, it was 47 mass shootings in little over a month. And unfortunately, I think it might be even higher now.
Yeah, well, look, the short answer is that yes, most free, democratic, elected countries around the world look at America and the gun crisis and think, what gives? I spoke to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the wonderful Jacinda Ardern, who's, in her short time in office, has taken some major, brave, coalition building policies and enacted legislation to respond to, for instance, gun violence. When they had the Christchurch massacre, that in very short order, she got the coalition together and they passed very important gun control laws. The same happened in 1996 in Australia when there was a mass killing in Tasmania. The same happened right here in the United Kingdom, also in 1996, when Dunblane happened, the shooting of a kindergarten and a primary school in Scotland. Immediately, the government and, across the aisle came with the opposition to put in very important, gun control laws, which are sensible gun control laws. The debate in the United States is wantonly derailed by the politics of it. It's wantonly derailed. And nobody in the United States, from our perspective here, ever suggests removing people's legitimate right to bear arms. Nobody ever suggests that. But people are wondering overseas why the vast majority of the United States, polled after polled after polled, say they want these sensible gun control laws, why it can't happen. And as you say, Dana, and we, break into coverage just about every other day. We watch these terrible things happen over and over and over again. And as you said, this number of mass killings, even since the Derek Chauvin trial for the murder of George Floyd has been underway, the number of people killed by police has been, it's something like, I think like for the last several years anyway, it's been more than 3 people per day have been killed by police in the United States, plus the mass shootings. So yes, in a word, people don't really understand that. And here's, where it builds on what John and David have been saying. The strength of the United States foreign policy is based on the strength of its domestic policy. What the US does at home is really important in the throw weight that it then has overseas. So when gun control is rampant, when mass incarceration happens, when racism happens, when the killing on and on and on of innocent Black people by usually white police, when that keeps happening, and when democracy is attacked from within, as it was during the past 4 years, that then is fodder for a Russia or a China or whoever it is to say, don't you come preaching to us. Don't preach to us. We just don't need to listen. And that is what Putin says, and that is what President Xi says. And just to fill in a blank also on the, you were talking, Dana, about the continuation in some areas of, aspects of the Trump policy. The same is true, for instance, in China. Trump identified something that everybody agreed with, and that was that China had unfair trade practices. He dealt with it pretty badly and not very successfully, but Biden has not lifted those trade tariffs. So, there's a lot of nuance sort of going on there. And I would say, just in terms of his current policy, Biden is an inveterate withdrawer. I was briefed, like many of you were, I'm sure, by people close to the president's thinking, who said he's been remarkably consistent in his entire career, particularly since he became vice president and now is president, that he's never wanted to stay in Afghanistan. He would have wanted to pull out of Iraq, before there was an occupation, and on and on and on. The question is the conditions of what's going to be left. So I think we just have to understand that it is pretty nuanced, and Biden is different, but in some areas, similar. And we're going to wait to see what he does on the Iran nuclear deal, because no matter what anybody thinks about Iran, that nuclear deal was an arms control agreement, so that you could have that and keep going at Iran over terrorism, over, Syria, over missiles, over all the other things that nobody likes about Iran. But to throw that baby out with the bathwater, and now to be dancing around and not getting the deal underway again is, I don't know where this is going to lead.
Yeah, no, I mean, you just laid out Afghanistan. You're exactly right, is an area where he actually really agreed with Trump, and he was in the minority in the Obama administration, leaving troops in Afghanistan, and he couldn't disagree with Trump anymore on Iran. I just want to say, as you were talking about the fact that America doesn't have a leg to stand on, can you imagine what American election observers would do if they went to a fledgling democracy and heard that they passed a law and prohibiting people from giving out water online? I mean, as they're doing here in Georgia and Florida. And anyway, moving on. So here's another question from a viewer. With right-wing populism and nationalism having a resurgence in both Europe and the US over the past several years, will Biden defeating Trump have a hand in slowing and or reversing the trend in Europe by effectively removing an ally in Washington? If so, in which of these nations do we see Biden's impact first? That's such a good question. John, do you want to try to take that one?
Well, I'll tee this up. Christiana's way more qualified than I am, but I will tee this up in the sense that just today you have Angela Merkel in Germany congratulating, looks like the heir apparent in her party, right? You have such a major player like Angela Merkel stepping off the stage. She has been not only a leader in Germany, but a leader of those liberal Western democracies, going back for years. When we covered the Bush White House years ago, we remember how important she was then. So that is a big moment of a transition in a country that has seen this ripple, call it what you will, nationalism, populism, far-right politics. The French elections are coming up, and that will be another key test. Will it be Macron versus Le Pen again? Will there be other plays there? That has to play out in stage. But I do think it's a great question. As we watch here in the United States, what is the future of Trump? And more importantly, what is the future of Trumpism? The xenophobia, the nationalists, the populists, whether it's trade policy or immigration policy. As we watch it here in the United States, there will be examples on the world stage, because whether it's Brexit, whether what we've seen in France in the last election, what we've seen in other countries, this is everywhere. It manifests itself in different ways, but the fear of globalization, the fear of people who look different, the fear of change, the pace of change has people frightened. Some of that fear is perfectly understandable. Some of it then goes into dangerous places in politics, gets stoked by people. So I'll leave it there to Christiane, but I do think in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to have several examples on the world stage that give us the global view as we go through 2022 and then 2024 to answer the question here at home.
Yeah, I agree. After 2016, where you had first Brexit, then Trump, everybody was really super concerned about populism and nationalism taking over Western democracy, essentially. It's also, particularly in the democratic world. And I was actually, encouraged in 2017 when Macron won that debate of ideas between democracy and values and tolerance, and Marine Le Pen, who is the antithesis, who's, the extreme nationalist. Her father was practically, practically a neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic. I mean, really a terrible, terrible situation. And to see those two facing off in the final round of the French elections was shocking. But Macron won that battle of ideas. We're not sure what's going to happen in the next election, because nationalism is now being shown in vaccines and here and there, and all of this stuff. I will say that after January 6th, the invasion and the insurrection on Capitol Hill, you read articles and you saw what was happening in Germany, which is one of the world's strongest democracies. After all the reforms they put in after the Second World War, with the American help of the Marshall Plan and everything else, became one of the most strong democracies in the world. Well, it was revealed after January 6th that actually that right wingism and that nationalism and that far rightism, in fact, is being used as a, you know, as an example by those who would also follow that line in Germany, and that's very, very scary. So I would just say that we have to keep watching this. It is scary. We have to make sure that the battle of ideas is presented right. And I'll just say one more thing. You know, identity politics is easy. Politicians get away with, I'm not going to say murder because, you know, I don't want to be misunderstood, but get away with a lot when they play the easy game of identity politics. And there are really interesting columns being written over here right now. The last one I read over the weekend in the FT. That's not the issue. Culture wars, identity politics, that is not the issue right now. The issue really is the economy and how we're going to meet the needs, the desperate needs of people all over the world who have been, you know, ripped to shreds by the pandemic. And so that's where our focus should be. That's where the focus of elected leaders and non-elected leaders should be. But it's always easy to take that us and them attitude to, and it's not always the right thing to be focusing on, or it's not always real. And I think we should take that into consideration now, because there's a real sort of a reset underway with Biden at home and around the world.
Yeah, and I mean, the danger is just marrying the two things you talked about, Christian, is the culture wars with economic despair. That's how Germany ended up where it ended up in World War II. That is the most dangerous.
I mean, you know, the culture wars here that we're talking about now are not nearly as profound as what we might have been talking after World War One. It's just cheap right now. It's creating these us against them, right, wrong, battle, and it's just dangerous.
It's so fascinating to hear you talk about it. Sounds like here. Go ahead, David.
Sorry, I was just to the questioner's question about populism and nationalism, and if indeed Trump's departure and Biden's arrival is somehow going to change that equation. Again, you got the perspective of John and Christian about whether or not it'll change the equation across the world. I will just note this morning, George W. Bush gave an interview and assessed his own Republican Party. This is George W. Bush, who left the White House 12 years ago and really receded from the stage of politics. We have not heard him engage in the political conversations of the day the way he did this morning, and assessed his party with 3 words, and they were not complimentary, I can assure you of that. His assessment was a critical one, and it was that he thinks the party is isolationist, protectionist, and nativist. That's how George W. Bush is assessing his own Republican Party. To John's point, it's not just Trump's departure. That's George W. Bush acknowledging Trumpism is living on and defining one of the major 2 parties in our 2-party system here in this country.
Yeah, look, it's troubling. It's interesting to hear him. I mean, you remember, you know, not 20 years ago, you know, George Bush set up some pretty dangerous politics himself by going into a war without the right reason. And not just that, by failing in the peace. It would have been one thing to go into the war, which they won handily. But it was another thing not to really work hard to bolster a country that was desperate, actually, for some help. Iraq wanted help. The military and security officials listened to George Bush, laid down their arms, did not challenge the United States because they thought that they would be helped on the road to prosperity and democracy. Of course, that didn't happen, and they forced an insurgency, and that insurgency we are still paying for today. And that's why these policies have long, and that was part of the beginning of these identity politics that we're facing in the West right now. Iraq with the refugees, and then Syria with the refugees and the migrants and all of that, created an easy way for nationalist and populist politicians to bang the other over the head. Exactly what George Bush is now saying, nativism. And that's not what is going to heal any of our countries or our world right now.
So fascinating. I could talk to you guys forever. I want to change topic to an important one, and this is from a viewer question that just came in. John, I'll put this to you. When will the U.S. share its substantial vaccine reserves with the world? Many countries have barely begun vaccinating their citizens because a lack of supply. I mean, we see what's going on in India. It's just horrific there. South America, it goes on and on and on.
I think the answer is soon. How soon depends on, we've had the Johnson & Johnson pause here in the United States, right? Johnson & Johnson had a supply problem anyway. They were behind the curve in their production. Then you had the pause put in place because of the concerns about the blood clots. We expect that to be lifted with some recommendations or advisory later this week. Advice that, younger women not take it, for example, and that just be given to older people. Sorry, my phone is ringing in my office. I'm going to do that and hang up and come back. And so this is a test, number one, of public health policy, and number two, back to Christiane's initial point of American leadership in the world, that it is, of course, you understand the political instinct of Joe Biden. He promised this during the campaign. Trump doesn't get government. I do. Trump doesn't understand this pandemic. I do. Trump doesn't have a team that can prove government can work, both in producing, distributing, putting shots in arms. I do. They've actually made the United States right now, among the larger nations, is leading the world. The United States is actually an example on one thing in the world right now it can be proud of, which is vaccine rollout and distribution. So then when you get to a comfort point in the United States and you get that average case count, which is now still around 70,000 new infections a day, and you can shove that back down to 40,000 and you're pushing it down, can you then lift your head and say, to the north and to the south, Canada and Mexico are well behind the United States. Can you say, okay, we're going to start ramping up more? Not just with vaccine that was meant to be for the American supply market, but to talk to the Merkels and the Macrons and the Boris Johnsons and the Trudeaus and all talk to everybody and say, how do we do this better? How do we have a centralized system? How do we reach Africa? I was looking at data the other day that was less than 1% of the population of South Africa has been vaccinated. If it's less than 1% in South Africa, think about the lesser developed countries across the continent there. So this has to be. We're a global community now, number one. You have a moral responsibility. You have a public health responsibility. You also have an economic responsibility if you want to live and trade in this global economy. If you want to get tourism back up, which is a piece of the global economy, some in more countries more than others. So this is a huge challenge for the administration. I think as we move from spring into summer, the CDC director, Dr. Walensky, just said the other day, of course, the United States wants to be part of this. Your initial instinct, help at home, deal with the challenge at home. And the United States, frankly, during the Trump years was an embarrassment in dealing with this pandemic because you had a president who didn't take it seriously, who ignored science and ignored common sense. So the first Biden challenge was to get the United States on a better footing at home. I do think as we move now into May and June, there'll be a lot of legitimate pressure and a lot of legitimate questions. Now that you're in a much better place at home, can you do a better job helping around the world?
I want to bring in another viewer question. I want to turn it back to Russia. David, I'll put this to you, and then I want Christiane to weigh in. After the administration faced questions that the proposed response to Russia's treatment of Alexei Navalny wasn't strong enough, Jake Sullivan indicated over the weekend that there would be significant actions taken should he die in custody, though he declined to specify what those actions might be. Knowing Putin and based on historical precedent, what measures do you see the Biden administration potentially putting on the table? That was my interview with Jake Sullivan, David, and he also said that they
yes, I was going to amend the question to say indicated to you, Dana Bash.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what I was going to say is that he was arguing that it is that the goal is better served doing it in private and not in public. To which you can ask the question, well, President Biden had a private phone call with President Putin, and that apparently was not part of the call, or at least that's not what they read out.
Right. And I think Jake Sullivan has indicated that the communication was happening at lots of other levels, not just the top level of Biden to Putin, to make this clear. Listen, it is true about foreign policy all the time and carrots and sticks. Not everything is for public consumption. If we were able to know everything that any administration was doing regarding a strategic competitor or opponent on the world stage in real time, that may diminish impact. I understand that, but I think this gets back to what we were saying before a little bit about countries don't want to hear the United States lectures anymore. And so there is this tension, I think, that exists for the Biden administration right now about how you stand up for Navalny here, which they do obviously day in and day out. There's no question about where they stand on this. And how aggressive do you get with Russia in a way that won't actually diminish the impact of the end goal of what you're trying to achieve when you are taking them on a sensitive issue for them. And I just think that constant balance, I think you saw in your interview with Jake Sullivan, the real-time struggle of that balance. But I am not at all of the mind that they're blowing this off. I mean, I think that we are going to see the Biden administration and Biden himself, should I don't know what Navalny's condition is today, but I mean, as Sullivan said, should he die in Russian custody, I believe I think it was made clear there are going to be real repercussions for that, and I would be terribly surprised if we didn't hear from the president himself on it.
What's your view, Christian?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, Jake Sullivan or the president or whoever did miss a beat by not, really standing up for Navalny very, very, loudly, because it's an American value. It's not Joe Biden and Alexei Navalny. It's the values of the United States of America that uphold opposition politics, pluralism, the respect for democracy, human rights, and an individual's right to, to life, frankly. America has always stood up for political prisoners, from Nelson Mandela to wherever, and therefore has to keep doing it publicly. So it's a good thing, Dana, you push Jake on that. We don't know what the answer will be, but we know that they've now had to say X, Y, and Z will happen. But, and again, quoting the former, John Sawyers, the former head of MI6, he was asked about Navalny specifically, and he said it's very necessary that Western leaders stand up and make a big noise about Navalny. That's our values. But he also said he doesn't believe Putin wants to see Navalny dead. It just would not be in his interest. He wants to silence him. He wants to punish him. He wants to do all the other horrible things that Putin does. And he obviously already, although they deny it, has attacked him with Novichok, the worst kind of nerve agent. And so Navalny is weak compared to perhaps others who might be in this imprisoned situation. But it either after your interview or whenever in the last 48 hours or so, they have moved him to a hospital area. And they say that they are feeding him with a vitamin therapy with Navalny's consent. Now, I don't know that's true, whether it's with his consent or not, but I kind of think they don't want him to die in their custody. And I'm going to be talking to Navalny's chief of staff, and we're going to have a bigger discussion about this very topic that we're talking about now with Celeste Wallander, who used to be, I think, special assistant on Russia to the president in the Obama administration. And she's very, very, knows exactly about, the things like solar winds and the election interference and all the rest. So I'll get some more info out of that. So, yeah, that I think when we're not really talking about China, which is, in fact, what the administration is going to do. All they want to do is clear their plane everywhere and go to China and figure that out. It's going to be really tough. I think it's going to be really, really tough to figure out how to deal with China, which really, as an interviewee said to me the other day, or I asked him, is China even shameable? I mean, is there anything you can hold over China's head to get it to do anything like uphold human rights or democracy? Look at what it's doing in Hong Kong. It is literally violating a solemn agreement that is signed with the Brits for 50 years of one country, two systems. And it's like a new election law, a new security law. People, there's a massive brain drain now. There's a massive number of democratic leaning people there imprisoned. I mean, it's scary. It's making threatening noises over Taiwan. What does that mean? Is the United States going to be prepared to defend Taiwan as it says it will, even militarily? This is where it's going to be really, really tough. And I just want to say one more thing on immigration, because it's such a hot button issue, and on migration and migrants. In all of our graying societies, where the demographics are falling and the birth rate is falling, we need migrants to fill the empty jobs. End of. all over the West, in the United States, all over Europe, everywhere. There must be a sensible way to deal with that, which then doesn't just fuel further populist politics, lazy, cheap, dangerous, and ugly populist politics.
Yeah, it's all related. Okay, first of all, vitamin and Z. I'm going to be saying those two words all day because you don't hear that very much in America, and it just sounds so great. Christian, you have to go do one of the interviews you talked about, but 30 seconds.
I do. The chief of staff, in fact, Navalny's chief of staff.
Okay, so in 30 seconds, somebody who has seen more and been in more war zones, interviewed more heads of state than any of us, combined or will ever do. Give our viewers one sort of morsel of hope based on what you're seeing now.
I am the eternal optimist. I'm about to deliver a commencement speech where I will be so upbeat. And I will say, this is what I genuinely do believe. Let's just take your country, right? Let's take Myanmar, two very different countries. The people of the United States got up and defended democracy in the last election. That's all you need to know. The people of the United States said leadership was important. When it came to judging literally life and death, that good leadership can save lives and bad leadership can cost lives, they went to the polls and they voted. In Myanmar, you have a very young democracy, only since like 2015 or something like that, which is now being overrun by a military junta. And yet young people and women are on the streets right now defending their rights. And the military is using heavy weapons and weapons that shouldn't have no place on urban streets. And so that gives me hope. And what gives me hope also is the renewal of protest, because that is a legitimate civil right. And there's many years where people didn't go out onto the streets in the United States or anywhere to protest the manifest wrongs and manifest injustices. And the killing of George Floyd and what we're going to see, unfold in this trial puts the whole idea of civil rights and justice on trial in the United States. And what happens in the United States then happens around the world. So I think the protest culture that has come up by ordinary people to try to claw back basic fairness, basic decency, basic justice is a really important thing. And that's what came in the 4 years when it was being crushed. So whenever these rights are crushed, the equal and opposite reaction happens. And that's what gives me hope.
Great place to end. Christian, have a good interview. Thank you so much. John and David.
I'll let you know what he says.
Yeah, please do. And I want to let everybody know that you should tune in next Tuesday, April 27th at 10 a.m. CNN's chief climate correspondent, Bill Weir, is going to be here to moderate a discussion on the climate crisis and take your questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.